There's been a lot of double talk about Final Fantasy XVI, and as much as I love this game, I found myself extremely frustrated with large portions of this playthrough. Large content creators have had a lot to say about the game along the same vein, and we're going to cover that too. Some of them absolutely dunking on the game in areas that it probably didn't deserve it, while others are defending the game in the areas that it's the weakest. I'll also preface this by saying if you clicked on this expecting a flowery review of Final Fantasy XVI, you're watching the wrong video. This is actually one of my favorite games of all time, but what does that say about my taste when that accolade places it alongside games like Chrono Cross and Skyward Sword? I love this game, but I'm gonna rip it to fucking shreds when it deserves it. I will give an unbiased and fair review of this game, highlighting the good, the Solace, and the bad, the Dread. And we're gonna come correct about this shit. But before we get into it, I'm Solace, this is Solace and Dread. We produce analytical content as well as reaction videos, primarily focused on Square Enix, Nintendo, and Capcom publications. Follow us on Twitter, or X, to keep up with everything that we're doing, or you can watch us play these games live over on Twitch. Let's start with Solace, the good.
Probably going to finish Final Fantasy 16 this week. I thought the game was good. I mean, again, I don't think that the game is a perfect 10. I've enjoyed the game. I think the game's good. Like, I would rate the game a 9.5.
Now, honestly, I mostly agree with everything that Asmongold was saying. I do feel the game is a really, really strong entry. I might not have given the score quite as high as he did, but I think he's pretty much on track. The combat is really satisfying, and it's one of the game's biggest, if not few, hooks. They took a harsh departure from Final Fantasy's normal formula, but I think it works, as we've clearly discussed. So many of you hated me for that video. The combat starts off really strong and challenging, but by the time you get a grip on it, you start to melt everything really quickly. We're going to talk about that more later. I do wish that there was more than one character to control, but the amount of abilities that you have that allow you to vary your playstyle definitely make up for that. Overall, I think they did the combat just right. Now let's talk about the visuals, because it's a beautiful game. Visually, it's the tits. And who doesn't like those? The world is gorgeous. Some of the time you just want to stop and stare out at the landscapes, or look closely at some of the details too. And the combat looks spectacular in both the icon battles and the regular fights. And the character designs are mostly good. Personally, I think that Clive is the coolest Final Fantasy protagonist we have ever seen. No one can really fault this game on the beauty. But the main story quest is the game's shining star, most of the time. Whether you're infiltrating a castle or racing towards a mountain god to punch him in the mouth, it's usually pretty good. There's a lot of lore that sometimes gets confusing, and honestly most of it isn't needed in order to follow the story, but they do have a character dedicated to giving lessons on the lore, not to mention the active time lore if you want to keep track as you're going through. I said it before, but I'll say it again, this needs to be the fucking standard with all video games. I never want to not be able to look up the lore as I'm playing through. The emotional depth of this group is satisfying. There's so much to learn about this group, though sometimes you learn a little bit more than you need to. But because of that, by the end of the game, you really feel like you know this group. For a game that only has one truly playable character, you have a bigger party and family than nearly any other Final Fantasy game. Also, on that note, I need to talk about the dragon in the room, Dion. I just gotta say how awesome it is to have an openly gay male character, and it's not a point of focus or a fucking thing. He's just gay, and that's that. Even better that they refused to edit that out for the bigoted government of Saudi Arabia. Fucking kudos. As far as I'm concerned, Dion is the most powerful gay character of all time. And now, in my heart, Bahamut is canonically gay. You won't ever convince me otherwise. Now let's shift slightly to the music. The music kind of mirrors the game in that, at its heights, it's some of the best music in the entire series. But at its lows, it's all but forgettable. Not too much to say here, as it's all about personal taste, but I never found myself annoyed by the music at any point. The only real issue I had was small issues with talking over the dialogue, but that's adjustable. And on that note, the dialogue and voice acting are top notch. I know a lot of people are a huge fan of Ben Starr's entire performance, and I do like the way he portrayed Clive. I think my biggest issue with it though is sometimes it felt a little bit Batman-y, where he was just gruff all the time. Sometimes it got a little grating because he talks a lot, but that's just personal taste. That's not necessarily a bad thing. And Sid was one of the best voiced characters of all time. I honestly cannot think of a character that I enjoyed their voice acting for more than Sid. Finally, what kills a lot of games for me was the ending, and this game's ending is fantastic. They subverted my expectations, they didn't play it too safe. There are parts that are a little ambiguous, but we'll leave that for another video. Suffice it to say that the story is complete and it doesn't need patching or DLC, which most of you agreed with on our polls on both YouTube and Twitter, which, by the way, please follow us on fucking Twitter. Or X. I keep saying Twitter. I would love to leave this game as complete and not get any DLC, but hey, I'm not gonna be mad if we get it. I just don't necessarily want it. Now, I mentioned the combat before, but I really want to go back and touch on that a little bit, because the combat of the game is definitely what is the most engaging, right? Some of these fights were some of the best fights I've ever experienced in any video game, ever. Thinking about the battle with Bahamut and Titan, even the final boss, they were all phenomenal. This is why the game is so highly rated in my book. Those heights are high, but then you would be matched in MSQ by doing some of the most inane, boring fetch quests right after some of the highest heights I've ever seen. And this is where we start to get into the dread.
People aren't going to like it when I eventually make a moist meter on it, but it's the fucking truth and it's time to face it now. The game's level design is non-existent. Every single fucking level in that game is horrible. It is literally hold forward, you maybe get 2 mobs to fight, and then another cutscene, and it's just rinse and repeat every single time. There is no exploration. The open world is so fucking dead and empty and boring. All the side quests I've done so far are trash. It is literally just, here's one mob, now hold forward again, here's another mob. Okay, now here's the cutscene. Now hold forward, here's another mob. Like, there's just nothing to explore or really do in any of the levels. But the game, overall, I still think is really fun. And I also don't like the complete absence of RPG elements, really.
I gotta say, he's a little harsh, but what he's saying is mostly right. I truly don't enjoy agreeing with Charlie's negative takes on games, but I think this time he was fair. There are elements of this game that would put it in the masterclass or masterpiece category, where it's unforgettable, a must play, the game of generations, and then there's so many things that it's fucking lacking that keep it from ever making it into that echelon. The level design is bad. Not a single puzzle in the game, and there's very little reason to explore. I've never seen peaks and valleys like this. The pacing is wild, and it doesn't help that the gameplay doesn't vary at all, ever. And side quests, they're boring. A lot of side quests in Final Fantasy are filled with mini games that change how you interact with the game, or they're extremely rewarding. Think about it. When you think about Final Fantasy, one of the first things that you think of is Blitzball or Tetramaster, or the shotgun blast of mini games in the Gold Saucer, or fishing, that kind of stuff. But in this game, your gameplay never ever changes. The criticism of the MMO-like side quests is valid. You're always doing one of 3 things: talking to an NPC, killing a mob, or picking up an item. That's literally it. This is by far the biggest issue with Final Fantasy 16. And what gets under my skin is, as soon as you mention this, the Final Fantasy Defense Force crops up and they immediately cherry pick 5 or 6 of the best side quests that happen at the very end of the game or in the beginning of the game. They hold them up and they're like, look at this, look, this is good, but it's in a sea of 100 other bland ones that plague the game with stilted dialogue and are building out a world that is an intentionally bleak and dreary landscape with almost no joy or fun. Yes, there's side quests that are heartwarming and actually rewarding, especially at the end of the game. But highlighting those few and saying, look how good all the side quests are when it's in a sea of crap is fraudulent. This is why old school Final Fantasy fans are validated when they give criticism of the game. It lacks one of the most identifiable parts of the franchise. And they intentionally did this as to not break immersion, which is the most ridiculous decision ever. But I won't harp on it. It's just dry. To say it succinctly, the side quests are good, but not fun. They're good in the sense that watching a filler episode in One Piece is good. Another smaller issue is the party not having any dialogue when they're following you 98% of the time during side quests. Every great once in a while they'll chime in and say something, but more often than not they just follow you like quiet blank DPS zombies. I don't like this. It doesn't need to be like Forspoken levels where they're talking constantly with cringy dialogue, but Forspoken did something to properly address this and gave you a banter slider. Give us the option. That was actually a brilliant idea. Did I just praise Forspoken for something in a review of Final Fantasy 16? Yes. How about another? All 11 women in Forspoken passed the Bechdel test, but you know what game doesn't pass the Bechdel test? Final Fantasy 16. Okay. There is like one exchange where it almost kind of passes the test, and that is with Jill and Tarja. But come on, man, the representation here is not the greatest. Par for the course on Final Fantasy. They've been guilty of this for years, and admittedly, this is far from the worst that it's ever been. At least Jill has an arc that sees her reclaim some of her power and her self-respect, and she does it in an explosive way. And it's really good, but that arc pretty much wraps by the end of the second Crystal Dungeon. While it is really good, beyond that, Jill is then put into the same tropes that other Final Fantasy women have fallen victim to. You gotta rescue her 3 times. Then in the end, she gives up her power to Clive in the most submissive manner possible, coupled with a kind of awkward love scene. She's great representation, until she's not. A full video is coming, focusing just on Jill, and I'm also gonna call somebody out for spilling bullshit out of their face. Now let's talk real quick about Final Fantasy mode. It's where the challenge of the game lies, but it's nearly pointless. Nearly. It's not that much harder. More of the same with spongy enemies. If the combat doesn't hook you in your first playthrough, then Final Fantasy mode ain't it. I just don't see a point. I genuinely feel that a harder difficulty mode should have been offered from the very beginning of the game. Harder than action mode. My favorite RPG franchise, which is Star Ocean, had replay value because of the increased difficulty, and when you're playing through the story, there are different choices and different characters to play that affect your gameplay and affect your story. That is replay value. This is not that. Honestly, this difficulty or Final Fantasy mode could have been relegated to the Arete Stone and made it actually useful and used as an unlock for the final weapon. It doesn't contribute to trophies. There isn't really much point for the Arete Stone as it is. I don't know. Maybe this is just my opinion here, but I don't think it's worth going through the game just for that. I just don't. Not a second time. Also, action mode probably should have had enemies scale and level with you. Doing the side quests left you overpowered and thus destroying everything you came across in the main story. The only time I even died was some random hunt where I wasn't paying attention and got kebabbed. Even the hardest hunt was kind of a joke. Final Fantasy is known for some tough super bosses. I don't know where they went. Linking all this together, despite my heavy criticism of the game, it is really fucking good. I'm just passionate about it because if they had just kept a few more the conventions of the franchise, then this could have been a masterpiece as opposed to just Game of the Year material. Speaking of, now people aren't even sure if it's gonna win, and considering how I felt about Tears of the Kingdom, that's really upsetting. Honestly, this should have cleared easily. As I've said repeatedly on social media, which by the way, follow me on Twitter, but X! The highs are the highest heights Final Fantasy has ever reached. The lows are alongside the depths of Final Fantasy VIII levels of dryness. It's exceptionally painful when it was an intentional choice that hurt what could have been a top 5 game of all time. Anyway, that's it from me. Thanks for watching, we'll see you soon, and long live the Turtle Kingdom.